I'm Kimberly Carter Gamble, and I'm the producer, director, and co-writer of the film.
I'm Foster Gamble, and I was a researcher and co-writer and headed up the visual design for Thrive One.
We're reviewing this 8.5 years after its release, where we're witnessing many of the things that we predicted and warned about. And also, we're right on the brink of releasing our sequel, Thrive 2, This Is What It Takes. So we're going to take this time now to walk through memories of making this film and also add some updates on what we see going on now from a Thrive perspective. We knew that we had, I think it was 68 different controversial facts in this, so we had them independently fact-checked with our accredited fact-checker to make sure everything was accurate, and it's held the test of time.
So what most people don't realize is that this opening was my opportunity to establish a creation story, starting with spirit coming into matter at the atomic level through the geometry of the periodic table, and then that complexifying into molecules, and then the molecules joining together into cells, the cells into organisms, and the organisms becoming more and more complex under the sea. Ultimately, life emerging from the sea onto the land. And then we begin an ascent through the plant world and climbing up. This is meant to subliminally suggest the actual ascent of human consciousness. As we're rising up from sea level into the mountains, following the stream uphill, and then finally to the peak, representing human consciousness able to actually turn and reflect on the whole of creation.
And then to do what life is meant to do, to thrive. Thriving is the natural flow of life.
We wanted to present some of our most favorite examples of just thriving, shining through human eyes, to set the stage for the dilemma that we have come this far, but we're actually still threatening our very own existence and the existence of the planet.
Yeah, I'm really touched by the music. Dan Alvarez and Gary Malkin, the composers of this original score, made such a difference to the story and just the emotional quality of every bit of it.
Vast ability and unlimited potential, with a brain capable of complex and soaring self-reflection.
We knew we wanted to create a juxtaposition between this thriving and our potential and the state of the world that we find ourselves in, which of course was the motivation for us in making this film. And yet choosing how to portray thriving is a lot more fun and easier than choosing sort of what level of gruesomeness we're going to bring to show the state of the world. And it was really important not to assault people so much that they would have to brace themselves against the film, and at the same time not hold back from, being honest about the truly sad and desperate state that we are in.
As an enemy to life itself and to its own home? I don't think so. My name is Foster Gamble.
This is the library in our house. We filmed all kinds of scenes throughout our house, which I'll point out as we go.
People have called me the question guy since I was a kid, and this was intended to be a question-led adventure, asking questions like what happened and what can we do about it.
I set out on a journey, seeking to answer questions like, is it even possible for humans to thrive? If so, why aren't we?
The whirlpool in water image is really important to me in understanding this whole notion of the torus and the notion of distinct and unified, made of something but distinct within it.
I found a code, a pattern in nature that's been embedded in arts and icons throughout the centuries. I believe this code holds...
We wanted to open up a file folder in the mind of the viewer for the vast amount of information they were about to be exposed to. So we're giving glimpses, planting seeds of what's to come.
The system is rigged, and I found out what we can do about it. My journey revealed ways we can claim our power to create liberating, healthy systems everywhere on Earth. I have realized that we are not a mistake. We are simply mistaken. We've been blinded to our brilliance, shorn of our strength, ignorant of our genius, unaware of our true power and magnificence. But all that is about to change.
I was strongly influenced by Carl Sagan in his Cosmos series when I was younger, and that's probably what gave me the notion of creating a magic carpet, a high-tech carpet that we could fly through the cosmos on into various scales. When I suggested that to the team, all I could hear was crickets. But eventually, people came around, understood what I was talking about, and it ended up giving people kind of a home base that they could come back to from all the different places we were visiting. And the right and left screens are intended subliminally to suggest the right and left brain. So the insights are on the right, the graphs and charts are on the left, and then in the center of the module is like the thalamus of the brain. This is our compass for navigating both morally and scientifically, where the torus could be the blueprint for wholeness throughout the universe.
After a lifetime quest, I've come to believe that this pattern actually holds the key to a world that works for everyone. So let's go.
I remember Clear Compass Media, the name we chose for our company. We wanted a true north, the sense of a compass to help guide us.
We were looking for a single word title that would encapsulate our vision for what was possible for humanity. When I was trained in advanced driving, my instructor told me, look as deep into the curve as you can, and that will help coordinate with your body with your vehicle. So that's what we were doing in coming up with the title Thrive.
Oh yeah, here I remember I would get dizzy, so I had to have it slowed down, our little dive into the earth. I was always like, slow it up, slow it up.
I grew up in a world...
So as part of the Gamble family from Procter & Gamble, you can see in these pictures that clearly I was being groomed for quite a different path than the one I ended up on.
...to be a leader in the establishment, but I chose a different path.
We decided to break the film into chapters because we had so many seemingly unrelated things that we were cohering into one story. We thought chapters might help track it.
So when I was working on a particularly heavy part of the script writing, I went to Kimberly and said, how in the world can we let people know that their hair's on fire without freaking them out? And without skipping a beat, she says to me, what I would do is I would say, look at this beautiful bowl of water. And by the way, your hair's on fire. And that's when we decided to start with the code, which is really the key to the solutions before going into things like the global domination agenda.
Whirlpool pattern. And I just knew that the flow of energy I was seeing was the same.
One thing I didn't tell in this story was that on this bus ride where I had this revelation, the best teacher I ever had throughout school was on the bus. And he was my physics teacher also. And I went to him and shared what I had just experienced. And to his credit, rather than saying, well, duh, yeah, there are these patterns throughout the universe, he said, that's amazing. Keep going on that and let me know what you discover.
Is known by some in the scientific world. It turns out that in 1921...
I remember this whole notion of quanta and how these little packets of wholeness was how I actually could wrap around these more complex scientific notions. And so we always brought my basic understanding into the telling of the story.
Considering the enduring wonders of creation throughout the universe and how unsustainable so many of our human systems are, I figured learning how the universe creates and sustains life would actually be quite useful.
And I wanted the endangered species to be looking directly in the eyes of the viewers right off.
Called a quantum, is made out of its surroundings, but is distinct within it, like a whirlpool in water.
Yeah, this is cymatics. Cymatics really shows the effect of sound on form. And it's untouched by any kind of, visual effects or anything, but understanding the effects of sound on matter actually has ended up having a lot of far-reaching ramifications in my life and is something that's included in a big way in Thrive 2.
Mathematicians call this pattern the torus.
So the guy who introduced me to this Torus pattern was one of my dearest friends and most important mentors, a guy named Arthur Young. We didn't have time to go very deeply into his work, but he was the inventor of the helicopter and came up with the most effective cosmology still that I've ever seen.
Futurist Dwayne Elgin explains how the torus is the primary pattern that nature uses for life at every scale.
Evolution means to unfold, to roll out. So the question is, what is the universe rolling out? And what the universe is rolling out is self-organizing systems, and you can see this at every scale. A self-organizing system is a technical term for just a system getting a hold of itself.
Part of our strategy with doing these visual effects with what we call the Navigator, this device at the center of the carpet, was to be able to depict as simply as possible the coherence of the universe, to show that this fundamental toroidal pattern is actually the fundamental pattern of sustainability at every scale throughout the universe, even though most people have never heard of it.
Field around the Earth, a similar magnetic field around an individual. We can see
Every scene behind the Navigator was designed to reflect the conversation that was happening within it. So there's just all this sort of subliminal through line that we were looking to create to provide coherence again and again.
one single project.
But another thing that the flying carpet allowed us to do is just to have an excuse to fly to any scale, from the subatomic to the intergalactic, and have human beings have a sense that they were still there.
These toroidal dynamics are visible at various scales. One of them is at the galactic level, which are huge spinning structures with billions of stars in it. Looks like typically big arms of galaxies spinning around, and
Yeah, Nassim is somebody, Foster actually recognized Nassim Harriman like 22 years ago, and they began their partnership then. So it's been fun to track the growing prominence of Nassim and his cosmology in the world, and also just the friendship and long-time relationship between Foster and Nassim. If you notice the light there on Nassim's face, that's coming from this little thing we invented called the Torus emanating device that was meant to flicker light for when we had the Torus there.
When I first met Nassim, it was at a talk that he gave in San Francisco, where basically most people thought he was crazy. And fortunately, the research that I'd been doing for 20 years in geometry allowed me to understand at an unusual level what he was talking about. So I went up after and asked him a couple of questions that had been perplexing me, that I hadn't been able to answer. And he was able to answer both of them right away. And long and short of it is we started working together the next morning and continued for the next 6 years.
this boundless sea of infinite torus flow.
At the time, Nassim was living in a van and just about to give up. And now he's changing physics, completing and correcting Einstein's work, and developing state-of-the-art energy technology.
Sort of like a skeleton. It's called the vector.
One of the most satisfying things after Thrive 1 came out is that we initially put it out in 10 different languages. And 17 people have personally translated the whole film into their language because they felt it was worth it to share with their culture. So the movie's now out in 27 different languages.
In 1997, I co-founded a multidisciplinary think tank called the Sequoia Symposium to study the pattern and explore its applications. Our collected research convinced me that the Torus and
A lot of times my role here was to take these scientific principles and lay them out in some way that would make sense to those of us who wanted to better understand the universe and where we fit in it, but who aren't going to be scientists. And so the whole notion of the VE and vector equilibrium and all these scientific terms we would just sort of break down into being able to show graphically in a much simpler form. In fact, the graphics team was all quite educated geometrically, and when I would review things, I could see they just saw dollar signs and months adding up, but a lot of stuff had to be redone.
limited clean energy would be one of the greatest breakthroughs in history. It could not just improve, but actually transform the quality of life on this planet. So I began to wonder who else knew about this pattern or about this powerful potential energy source. Some of the scientists at the symposium showed me how the torus has been encoded by different cultures for millennia. Apparently, ancient cultures had embedded this code in the most enduring forms then possible.
So the Ark of the Covenant depicted there is, in the minds of many of my colleagues, was actually one of the first free energy devices, that it was a capacitor with gold on the inside, gold on the outside, and acacia wood in between, and then the cherubim were giant electrodes on the top, and then the ark was literally an arc of electricity between them.
Piece of information in that temple.
I had heard about so many things with Nassim and Foster over the years, and their fascination with ancient cultures and how that was related to our future culture. And we ended up, since the making of Thrive, we ended up being able to travel to Egypt with Nassim and the Resonance Foundation, and actually have, I got a picture of Foster and Nassim in front of the Osirian temple, which is something that I had heard them talk about for years.
Codes relaying information about our world also wouldn't be limited to flat designs. His three-dimensional version of the Osirian symbol starts with the vector equilibrium, a perfectly balanced force field with 12 equal energy lines radiating out. They stabilize its center like the 12 spokes of a wheel.
So I was fascinated by ancient cultures and how this knowledge had been embedded in many of the cultures, and for a long time I couldn't figure out how that could possibly be until I began to realize that if extraterrestrials had been visiting the planet for a long time, then they would be, by definition, farther advanced than we were scientifically. So they would already know these principles of how to relate to energy, and therefore might have encoded them in buildings and books and stories and so forth all over the world.
Each of the pyramids. And then we
Gary Malkin, who's really an expert in indigenous, international music and indigenous music, lent a wonderful musical corroboration of the narrative here, so that each culture we went to had a musical relationship at the same time.
Now we travel across.
So again, the motif of the Navigator allows us to fly out of the clouds across China and all of a sudden just land down in the Forbidden City.
Then you go to the forbidden.
And once again, we had to slow it down so that Kimberly didn't get motion sickness, which I'm sure helped a lot of other people seeing the movie later on.
The food dogs, the guardians of the knowledge. They guard the knowledge under their paw.
The same geometry.
One of the issues that we came across when we were just, explaining so much in so short a amount of time was to have all this subliminal reinforcement of whatever it is we're talking about. So you see the same background we're talking about off of the Navigator, but then also we had to deal with how often we landed on the ground. Because flying off, as much as the Navigator was meant to be our home base, it's also off the ground. And sometimes people just need to be on the ground to feel like that's also a home base they can relate to. So I remember we tracked it with a color coding of how often we were on the spaceship, how often we were on the ground, and then when we're introducing things that are, Foster says that it's rocking his world, or I'll name that this is really a lot to take in, to help the viewer understand that this was a process for us too. And we recognize and still experience ourselves, what it means to have the earth shake and then arrive with a new understanding.
The double helix has an alphabet of 64 codons that are used to encode our human DNA.
So this scene on the carpet over Chichen Itza, though it looks easy, was actually one of the most difficult one for our visual effects team.
Most of the stories of ancient Egypt and Mayan and Incas talk about sun gods coming to the earth and teaching them engineering and writing and all of their science. I started to wonder if all these sun gods were not advanced civilization coming from another part of our galaxy. These texts and many ancient cultures describe them as coming in flying boats, or in the Vedic tradition, flying machines, and so on. There is many mention of these sun gods coming through time.
It's interesting, the whole thing about UFOs. I'm amazed at what a taboo subject it is. To me, it just seems like one of the most natural things that people would be interested in. And there's so much evidence from so many high-level people who actually have a lot of hardship in their lives once they acknowledge it. So, what's their motivation behind that? Anyway, getting into it is something that we felt really committed to, and to not be held back by the notion that it's somehow taboo to consider our place in this vast cosmos with, 10,000 Earth-like planets in the Milky Way galaxy alone.
He's conducted hundreds of interviews with top-ranking government and military.
So this segment on the history of UFOs was our attempt to get a tremendous amount of information all throughout history in a very short amount of time.
Reach the point of being sentient like we are, but whose technologies and perhaps social capabilities.
So the visual effects folks took a NASA photo and cut it up into layers to make the whole thing 3D so that we could actually fly through it.
In the Milky Way galaxy, that there are at least 10,000 Earth-like planets that have intelligent life on them, and that at least half of them are likely to be as advanced or more than ours. It's almost a certainty that there's intelligent life out there that have mastered the laws of the universe beyond what's currently taught at MIT and Caltech, to be able to transfer through space-time in real time through vast distances of interstellar space. We have over 4,000 cases where these objects have landed on terra firma and left physical evidence. We have over 3,500 pilot cases. We have hundreds of cases, including ones from the highest ranking investigator at the FAA, John Callahan, and numerous other operators where these objects have been tracked on radar going tens of thousands of miles per hour, or dematerializing and then reappearing in another point in the sky.
Yes, there have been ET visitation, there have been crashed craft, there have been material.
So here we just picked a small handful of clips from over 500 interviews with high-level, very credible people. These were mostly from Stephen Greer's Disclosure Project. And for anybody who's still wondering whether or not there are UFOs around the planet, this is a great place to start. Check out Disclosure.
I remember during this, the Vatican even came out with an official statement that it was all right to believe in UFOs and ETs. It didn't disqualify you from being a qualified religious person and still believing in God.
They had to do that to reconcile with. They've got a major observatory at the Vatican that's been collecting information that hasn't been shared for many years, that they know is going to be coming out eventually.
Several thousand miles an hour. So this thing fires.
In fact, there have been disclosures recently in the mainstream on CNN and in the New York Times.
This fires another beam of light, goes around like this.
This guy, Robert Jacobs, was in charge of high-speed photography for the Air Force. I love the look on his face as he's describing his shock the first time he saw what was on his film in one of these launches. They were trying to take a nuclear missile to test on the moon. And apparently, some sort of off-planet beings thought that was a bad idea and shot the warheads right off the missile.
I don't need to remind you, Major Mansman, of the severity.
We had one of our team members who didn't believe in ETs and UFOs, and it was very helpful. We'd like to have people with different worldviews on the team to see, their perspective and how we were telling the story. We're doing that as well with Thrive 2, and it's always helpful to get all the feedback.
Out of all of the evidence for the existence of UFOs, one extraordinary...
So I've always had a knack for geometry and studied it for 40 years. So when the crop circles started coming in, particularly in England, I could see immediately the 3D version of what people were seeing in the 2D patterns in the fields. And I remember realizing that if I were teaching an advanced college course on spatial geometry, I could literally use hundreds of them as very accurate diagrams for the main points that I would want to be communicating.
Including me at first.
Yeah, the thing with the crop circles, a lot throughout this movie, we were really just going for pattern recognition. There was so much to communicate that it was like you just could see that this isn't a one-time or a two-time thing, that there are hundreds and hundreds of recurring patterns in this. So the montage with the crop circles was a way for us to be able to reinforce that pattern in a more efficient and beautiful way. And as far as the beauty, we were really committed to having this be as beautiful as it could be, partly just to communicate our love of life and this planet, and what motivates us here, again, is to find the way to honor the possibilities.
And from a filmmaking point of view, describing the Arecibo message and then correlating it with the crop circle that seemed to be a response to it, and to do all that in a short amount of time was one of our biggest challenges in the entire film. So the layout of the graphics and the motion graphics, comparing the difference between the first message that we sent out and then the second message that came back in, was a fun challenge, and ultimately ended up condensing a lot of information into a very short period of time.
27 years later, in 2001, this crop design appeared in England, along with what could be a self-portrait of the sender. This message matches the format of the NASA signal and describes a different solar system from ours, a picture of the sender, non-human DNA, and a microwave antenna they apparently used to communicate, rather than the radio antenna that we used. The antenna symbol had appeared a year earlier in exactly the same field, right next to a working radio wave antenna, like the one NASA used to send out the original signal. NASA continues to officially deny extraterrestrial contact of any kind. And yet, year after year, these spectacular creations appear.
And then it was especially fun for me to finally be able to have our visual effects team bring these flat patterns to life in 3D so that other people could see what I'd been seeing for a decade. So the Torus kept being repeated, and the VE, the vector equilibrium. toruses within toruses. And to bring the vector equilibrium to life and then show how it related to the 64 tetrahedron crystal from ancient cultures and from the leading edge of advanced physics right now was one of the most exciting tasks for us in the visual design.
So many ancient cultures.
Yeah, I remember my dad, who was a successful filmmaker, always said that you'd know your movie was done when you could watch it without any sound and get the same feeling and story that you would get if you turned off the picture and only heard it. And I can remember when we did that with this scene and just feeling what it was that we were aiming to convey here, which really was the majesty and possibility of such an interconnected and alive universe.
Whoever created them, and wherever they're from, there must.
Here's a small little filmmaking note. In this scene where I'm sitting in front of the 64 tetrahedron crystal, if you look carefully, you'll see a red car on the road in the background. We had our visual effects team put that car in to bring to life a still photograph of this particular crop circle. So it's the little details that you may not notice that bring it to life.
Processing energy in a clean, safe, and limitless way.
Yeah, it was interesting. The way we did this was we had a green screen that we rented up in Oregon, and we would have one person come in, we'd interview them, they'd stay the night when a new one came in who we were going to film the next day. And so it happened that Lane Andrews ended up meeting with James Gilliland, who we filmed the next
The
day.
University of Nebraska, who has also researched UFO phenomena. Presenting at a Sequoia symposium, Dr. Kasher showed a remarkable series of drawings by a woman named Lane Andrews, who claimed to have been invited onto an extraterrestrial spacecraft. I was startled to see her.
It was very touching for me with Lane because her life had been sort of, I mean, I hate to say ruined because she still had a life, but it was really devastated by her experiences in the ET UFO world where she had contact that was extremely confusing to her. She couldn't really make sense of it. She would get what she called this mind scramble that she would have to then download in order to be able to function. And so when she met with James Gilliland, who was familiar with that kind of experience and shared having had contact with similar beings, she just sobbed. It was really interesting for me because the whole thing was new to me at this time. I got educated about ETs and UFOs after I started learning more about the new energy technologies, because before that I'd just been such kind of an earth activist that the ET issue didn't seem that relevant to me until I started understanding more about new energy technologies and the implications of intergalactic and interstellar travel. That it was really fun to have the people meet each other and to be a fly on the wall as they compared notes also.
Almost our twin brothers. So where are we going to be in a million years? We'll have solved all.
So Lane was drawing these very specific technical drawings with no technical background, and they also had scientific captions which she didn't understand.
Generate energy.
Somebody suggested she share them with this physics professor, Dr. Jack Kasher. He started recognizing some of the scientific language, and then it was only later that they realized that crop circles that came in after she had drawn the pictures looked exactly like them.
So here, once again, you see our library, the same library that was in the opening scene with Foster. I think it's in another scene as well in our house. That's Danny Sheehan is actually the one who introduced Foster and me. We met back at a think tank at Harvard a long time ago.
So for those of you who like Easter eggs, in this upcoming rabbit hole, there's a sequence of complexifying geometries, of platonic solids that are actually designed into the wall of the rabbit hole. You actually have to slow it down or stop it in order to be able to see it. But it's a sequence that goes from the simplest tetrahedron to the most complex dodecahedron. And then we fly to the Warden Cliff Tower. And here's an update on the Warden Cliff Tower. There's a company in Texas called Visiv that's partnering with another one called Zenic Power. And this company's been working for 20 years on restoring the technology that we're describing here that got shut down by J.P. Morgan when Tesla was trying to transmit both electricity and communications wirelessly.
Recognized how Tesla's invention could transmit electricity without wires. He then shut down Tesla's funding. Tesla's lab was burned down and he was ostracized, all for trying to implement his vision of unlimited energy for everyone.
So in the background here is the Sombrero Galaxy. This is NASA's #1 most popular picture ever. The reason we put it in the background was to keep reinforcing the notion of the torus as the fundamental pattern by having it in the background when Adam Trombley is speaking about the toroidal nature of his free energy device.
By mimicking the magnetic field of a planet and rotating this device, we could actually create...
In terms of the visual effects, we really needed to be able to illustrate these scientific concepts that have to do with energy, something that's invisible that you can see the effects of it, but you can't actually see it.
And the lines of flux of the magnet are pouring down and through.
Can't tell you how many inventors and healers and spiritual channels and others have thanked us since Thrive came out for making visible the dynamic of the torus, which all of those people try to teach about, but is usually very difficult to describe just in words.
It's literally true. To contemplate the implications of this means that every single place on Earth suddenly has power. Every single person on Earth suddenly has power. We have universal abundance.
Trombley had been invited to demonstrate one of his generators at the United Nations and the U.S. Senate. But these events were undermined by the first Bush administration. Then the device itself was taken in a government raid. Trombley's experience isn't unique.
Again, using the background to show the correlation between the cosmic patterns and the geometries for devices and so forth that we're illustrating.
Inventor John Bedini,
Unfortunately, the great inventor John Bedini, pictured here, died a suspicious death in November 2016 within 4 hours of his business partner and brother.
he announced that he was going to start offering them at low cost.
Once we put out this information about these different technologies in Thrive 1, we ended up hearing from nearly 1,000 different inventors from over 100 different countries in the last many years who contacted us, and many of whom didn't have patents. They understood the corruption of that process and who were working with really similar concepts. In fact, it's what inspired us to make Thrive 2, the sequel, because we heard from so many people with so many fabulous things in health and energy and environmental restoration, just all kinds of great technologies that we couldn't keep it to ourselves.
To me, that the technology is real. And the implications of that to me are absolutely thrilling.
Oh, John Hutchinson. I remember we heard that when he was doing his work, he had a neighbor who actually complained that articles were levitating off of their mantle in a house next door. I don't know if that's true, but that's what I heard. And I see
We
from
were
his
told
work.
that the authorities actually had to trump up a charge of possession of a firearm in order to get into his house to shut down his lab, because he had an antique musket hanging over the fireplace.
Oh, Malov, he was a real pioneer and a very touching part of this story for me. We had planned to film him, and before we got there, he was murdered.
Dr. Malov was mysteriously beaten to death in 2004. If these inventors were all hoaxers and charlatans, I wondered, why are they being suppressed so consistently and so brutally? I asked free energy inventor Adam Trombley why he thought this technology was being suppressed, and if the UFO phenomenon was related.
We've had major military people at great risk to themselves say, yes, these things are real. Why do you think the military-industrial complex doesn't want that statement to be made? Because you start thinking about what kind of technology is behind that. That's the bottom line. The suppression of UFO phenomena is hand in hand with the suppression of so-called free energy.
The energy is extracted from the fabric of the space.
So this visual effects depiction was the first time that we actually hint at the field around a new energy device being key to the electricity that's pouring through. And this will be greatly expanded in our upcoming sequel, Thrive 2.
Goodbye linear transmission of electricity through power lines, all that gone. Unfortunately, it's someone's $200 trillion piggy bank.
The Torus is still mimicked in virtually every single successful device that I've seen, even since our first film.
This information coming out would completely change geopolitical power.
Yeah, and here we were like, really, this technology is fabulous, and why is it fabulous? Is because of the impact on humans and the planet. That's really what we're after now, is bringing it back. There we are in our home again, shot with Brian O'Leary.
These concepts have been proven in hundreds of laboratories throughout the world, and yet they have not really seen the light of day.
Rather than smashing things together and trying to control the explosion, these new technologies rely on blending, of dancing with what naturally is. The common denominator of all the free energy devices I've seen is that they mimic in one way or another the torus energy shape. You don't have to believe in free energy technology to be concerned about the repression of ideas and inventions.
Once again, like the background of the oil refinery was an intentional contrast to what we've just seen with the free energy technology, and trying to do that, reinforcing visually what it is that we're saying narratively.
It was my beloved wife and creator.
Oh, there's the famous blue sweater. I think of this, looking at this blue sweater, so the way that came about, I had bought a new blouse that I was going to wear for hosting this, and we were renting a green screen facility up in Medford, Oregon, and we only had a certain number of days. And when my time came that was allotted for my interview, I put on my blouse and sat down, and the DP, Director of Photography, Stephen Gagne, said, "Oh, you're completely absorbed in the chair. That top doesn't work. You need something else." And there we were out in this place in Medford, Oregon. There was nothing around there. So a gal who was there as a gaffer and assistant and helping out said, "I think that there's a church secondhand shop around the corner somewhere." So she ran off to the secondhand shop, grabbed the only thing in it that might fit me, and came back with that blue sweater. And now when I see it, I think about how Foster and I look like matching twins with our blue tops and black pants, and that had not been the intention.
It would affect everybody. It would be applicable everywhere. These technologies are absolutely the most important thing that's happened in the history of the world.
So given the stakes, I decided to ask who's benefiting from suppressing scientific research? Whose wealth and power are threatened by access to clean, free energy? Who has a motive to set up a world where so few have so much?
So here are some more examples of how we wanted to lead into the next section on following the money with the questions that we were asking.
Journalism. If a story doesn't make sense, follow the money.
So this is where Kimberly's background as a reporter for Newsweek really informed us and taught me, if this situation doesn't make sense, follow the money.
Being dependent on oil ensures that energy corporations continue to reap phenomenal profits.
Yeah, this was a tricky one. We decided that we were going to name names in this, not to create an us and them, here's evil kind of a scenario, but because it's really important to understand a few things. One, it's not that many people who are actually behind this, huge consolidation of power and demise, as the rest of us would interpret what's happening. And to see also that personal accountability goes a long way. And these are people making decisions that impact everybody. And unless we're willing to really come to terms with that, it's hard to come up with solutions that are just kind of vaguely after something. And, toward that end, we really wanted to get at critical thinking, which is just so much a part of what has to happen now. And there are a lot of things that sound good that turn out not to be later. And I really learned that as a journalist, where the headline is, great thing, whether it's the Green Revolution or the promise of socialism or the Patriot Act or any number of things, and then you do your retraction later on the back page in small print saying, oh, actually, those didn't work out, right? And so we really wanted to set out a situation where people had enough information right up front that we're having more realistic assessments of what's going on.
But its true costs can now be seen. Taxpayers pay billions in subsidies to giant agribusiness corporations. Small family farms have all but disappeared. Biodiversity is destroyed. Toxic chemicals poison farm workers and pollute the land.
I know at the time this was filmed, it was 1 in 7 people were starving. Now, I think in 2019 and 2020, it was 1 in 9 people around the world is starving, although I don't know what the impact of COVID and unemployment and the economic ramifications are going to be. I know that a lot of progress has been made in terms of GMOs, including their being banned in many countries all over the world. And farmers also are now able to sue Monsanto. In fact, Monsanto's reputation got so bad that they essentially went underground by being bought out by Bayer. The resulting pharmaceutical, biotech, agricultural conglomerate poses its own threat, of course, as many of us believe we're seeing in the wake of COVID-19 and the totalitarian moves that are resulting from it.
In order to impose even more dependence of humanity on a handful of corporations is the ultimate step in this. We are, through what we are doing with seed, literally for the first time, creating a new colonization, which I call the colonization of the future.
And in this, where Kissinger says, who controls the money can control the world. And I see now this move in 2020 for a government-controlled electronic currency to be, really taking this to the apex, and something that we certainly need to be paying attention to.
For me, it was
I wanted to say here, note the grounding of the agricultural fields in the background, again, mimicking and reinforcing what it is that's being talked about.
Understand what's causing it and how it operates if the goal is to cure it. So I continued my investigation.
It can seem like a little thing, but those little continuities actually help tell a story visually in a way that's very important.
I began to see this same pattern of control in just about every area of our lives. And I always found the same families in charge, either directly through their banks and corporations or indirectly through their major foundations. Again, it was the Rockefellers who created the National Education Association with help from the Carnegie Foundation and later from the Ford Foundation. What the captains of
with the education piece, John Gatto was just one of my all-time favorite people who I had a chance to meet. It was freezing weather. We were back there. It was so cold. And we would huddle together in the car and then later in his cabin. And he and I struck up a real friendship and actually became pen pals. And he just recently passed this year. But before that, I would go to the mail excited to see if I had a letter from him and write him back. I think as modern as he ever got was a fax machine.
For example, is largely funded by the Rockefellers, who used their funding to influence AMA research.
So one of the big surprises for us is that Thrive was an expressly trans-political film. And then it turned out that some of our interviewees who happen to identify themselves as progressive thought leaders on the far left, expected us to agree with their politics, and then ended up publicly dissociating from Thrive because we didn't. We always interviewed people for their expertise, not their politics, but these days many people are unable to even think in transpolitical terms. Anyone who doubted the infiltration of Big Pharma into our lives has had a chance to see in the interim the scourge of opioid addiction, the virtual takeover of TV ads, magazines, billboards, and now even the push for mandatory global vaccination.
I was just looking this morning and read that AstraZeneca started manufacturing 2 billion doses of untested vaccines just so they could have a jump on the market in case they work. It's like, okay, wait a minute. Do you think they have some incentive to say those vaccines work? And anyway, when you follow the money and track it in this way, you can get insights into a lot of things that are going on.
The answer is yes.
I spent years since Thrive 1 came out traveling all over investigating different new health technologies that are energy-based that would not have all these side effects. And I've had an opportunity to see one of the few remaining real Rife devices. There are a lot out there that claim to be, but this was quite a stunning bit of technology, and we're going to have a chance to explore more the effects of frequency on healing in Thrive 2.
Within 3 months, they were all successfully cured.
I spent a lot of time in this world of healing since making this film, Thrive 1, and I'm very happy that I'll be able to be spending more time bringing encouraging information out in Thrive 2 about these new technologies and how they really are making a huge difference. And I'm hopeful and confident about getting them out into the world. And cancer has run. Oh, there we are in the house again. I found out that it's all about patents. If a pharmaceutical company can patent and make money from treatment, especially one that we have to keep on using, then that's what we get. Otherwise, we don't even hear about it. It's not just Rife who got shut down. Reen Case had an old Indian Ojibwe formula that was effective. Harry Hoxsey and Max Gerson had natural remedies that worked. But if you go and you look them up, the AMA makes them sound like complete quacks. And that's where following the money has been so helpful, because the same powers who control the AMA and their research and funding control the pharmaceuticals. So there's a multi-trillion-dollar financial incentive to suppress cures that can't be patented. Knowing that cures exist has not taken away the anguish I feel from losing so many people I love to cancer. It's given me something really satisfying to do with the pain. And I believe when we take the love and devotion that we have for everyone who's died and who will die unnecessarily, and direct it to developing and getting these cures out to people who need them, we can break this cancer legacy and heal.
As difficult as it was for me, I have come to an inescapable and profoundly disturbing conclusion. I believe that an elite group of people and the corporations they run have gained control over not just our energy, food supply, education, and healthcare, but over virtually every aspect of our lives. And they do it by controlling the world of finance, not by creating more value.
So this pyramid diagram ended up being our most viral image. It's still spreading all over the world, and it's held up over time. It's got a lot of information packed into it. But the reason it's held up is because it's simply being proven to be true.
And use it to tax and control us whether or not we...
Once you understand this hierarchy, it really helps to see some of the practices that, I don't know, I didn't question them before, like the fact that you go with money to make a deposit, and then there's a few days before you can access that money. It's like, there's complete corroboration of the funds. So why do they get to hang on to the money before you can use it? And there's all this behind the scenes trading going on where they're making all the money on the weekends and with those few day delays in you getting access to your deposit. And I never, could have made sense of that before I understood this hierarchy and who's really in charge and how it works.
Interesting how few questions we actually ask about.
Now, we took a lot of flack for having David Icke in our film because he's controversial. But I'll tell you, everything he said in this film has held up. He's actually probably the most comprehensive and accurate conspiracy analyst that we have yet seen.
What actually happens is you ask for £50,000. They type into your account £50,000. That's all they do. They don't mint any coins. They don't print any money.
Yeah, I think that was another part of the learning for me, is that I want to be able to really take advantage of what somebody has to say and their research that I value. And it doesn't mean that I agree with or corroborate anything or everything else that they have to say. And being able to learn from people like that is a very important tool in gaining a comprehensive perspective, which is why, we didn't identify with the left, we didn't identify with the right, we stayed transpolitical the whole time. That's our orientation, because we're just looking to see what's true. I think understanding the banking has been, for us, it's especially key because money is one of the primary tools, I'd say the primary tool by which people can be enslaved or liberated, right? If we need to have access to the money that we make in order to fund the things that we actually care about. And when that can be controlled and kept from us, then we're necessarily dependent upon the decisions of others. And as I think the state of the planet has shown, those decisions are not in our best interests or the best interests of the Earth.
And it's only become more clear since Thrive 1 came out that fractional reserve banking and fiat money are the linchpins of the globalist control over the rest of us. Now it's being exposed and replaced by crypto and asset-backed banks and currencies even faster than we had hoped.
In the 17th century, when people were trading in gold. Gold was heavy to carry around, so people stored the actual metal in vaults and traded receipts instead. Those receipts were the first paper money.
Yeah, this motif, it's kind of a cartoonish way of describing it, but we wanted it just to be really basic and simple. There's Foster's, I love that, the lantern lighting up with a good idea. But that was the point, was to have, we made it this simple on purpose because we were trying to take what had become really complex. So many people saying, I can't understand economics, it's so complicated. Actually, there are a few basic patterns in it that once you get it, it makes a lot of sense. And again, it shows us where we need to focus in order to come up with solutions, which is why I think all these alternative currencies are coming to the fore now. And I think it's fabulous and critical.
Under this fractional reserve scheme, we inevitably become debt slaves to a ruling class of financial...
And you can see that we chose to create a background of Manhattan behind the flying carpet, which is, of course, the home of Wall Street, to correlate with the finance discussion.
Catherine
Austin Fitts, she was a huge ally for us in this whole process. She, super credible, former Assistant Secretary of Housing and Urban Development, very knowledgeable and better at being able to take, pretty complex economic policies and the history and break it down into really simple, understandable terms that were equally accurate. And she actually I was homeschooling my son to the curriculum of Thrive 1 while we were making it, and Catherine became his economics mentor. At the time, she actually developed a whole homeschool curriculum, high school curriculum for honest economics. The whole thing on Jekyll Island, whenever I see that picture of everybody gathered there making such gigantic decisions that have impacted us all with the forming of the Federal Reserve, When I'm sitting around tables sometimes now with these fabulous innovators and inventors and solutionaries from all over the world, I think someday these are the pictures that are going to show the transition out from under that.
The respective governments in the countries where they operate. And they've been given
When the Fed was created in 1913, the national debt was $1 billion.
the nation's money supply.
Now it's over 22 trillion. So the Fed didn't exactly do the stabilization of the economy that it was
What did the bank
touted as representing.
They promised to create money out of nothing now that they've got this legal power to do it anytime the government needs it.
And since 2008, we've witnessed the greatest...
Probably the greatest source of humor for me in the making of Thrive was the whole notion of the flying magic carpet. And there were so many jokes that happened about that because we had to imagine things where they were located, the Toruses over the Navigator, the little projector and so forth. And then there were jokes about falling off the edge of the magic carpet and who left the door of the Navigator module open and so forth. So we couldn't resist at the end. While we had the film crew there, we actually created 3 humorous outtakes to kind of illustrate some of that stuff. And we've included those as part of the bonus section that's attached to the director's cut here. So be sure and check those out.
Pages right next to Federal Express. It's a privately owned central bank.
What is the proper relationship? What should be the proper relationship between a chairman of the Fed and a president of the United States?
Oh, Greenspan, he's such a creep. I remember that we actually just came upon this and saw it and then tracked down the clip to include in the movie. And it was a good way to show, like, once you understand what's really going on, you hear the people behind it actually say it very openly. You can hear that again and again.
Money on behalf of the Treasury.
Yeah, this part, Catherine, in one of her many fabulous metaphors, had come up with the whole notion of a tapeworm.
So you have a small group of bankers who understand the data.
Because the tapeworm makes you crave what's good for it instead of what's good for you, which is, a perfect way to describe our current financial system. And I remember we had to go through all these pictures of tapeworms and learn all about tapeworms in order to get the right images to the visual effects team to create this, to describe our current economic system.
Is a system that's very dynamic, and it's trying to optimize. But intertwined in the core of it, you have a...
Once again, it was choosing, okay, how gruesome do we want to actually be here? It needs to be nasty enough to convey what this system is doing, but we don't want people turning the movie off in the middle.
You have a parasite that's very much manipulating and engorging itself at the expense of the whole.
We live in a tapeworm economy where the financial elite are the tapeworm and they're feeding on us. And they don't like it when people blow their cover. After Catherine began exposing government corruption at the highest levels, the FBI raided her company and seized its assets. She was dragged through the courts for 10 years before being found innocent. So we've got the Federal Reserve.
So here we selected a background of a storm brewing coming in over Washington. The intention of this was to give a sense of what happens when people don't like it when you're blowing their cover.
The economy and remain independent of politics. But in fact, in close to a century of existence, the Federal Reserve has done just the opposite. Since they took charge, we've been robbed through inflation, and the purchasing power of the dollar has declined more than 96%.
Oh, yeah. I remember when we were on location and filming, and there was more security around the Federal Reserve than there was around the White House. Like, we had to get way back with the telephoto lens just to get a picture of the Federal Reserve.
America experienced the Great Depression. My research revealed that before the big crash in 1929, the elite bankers pulled their money out of the stock market. After the crash, they used that money to buy up cheap stocks and smaller failing banks for pennies on the dollar. Among the bankers who consolidated their wealth this way were the Rothschilds, Rockefellers, and Morgans.
Now we've actually seen proof that virtually all the markets are rigged. The interest rates, the gold, the stock, the real estate markets, becoming clearer and clearer to people all over the world.
Yeah, we were always trying to come up with, I mentioned I was homeschooling my son to this, and just trying to come up with images that would make sense to describe this financial world. So that's how I remember saying it's just like rotten oranges. You know it's going to happen when you open up the box, but if you can ship them out before then, that's the way it works. So we kept that notion of the rotten oranges even in the film.
Since they were the ones who packed the boxes in the first place. When the rotten oranges, what we hear about is unsound loans.
So as horrible as it was for people to realize that as taxpayers we had to bail out the wealthy crooked bankers, in the interim now they've gone even further to legalize actual bail-ins, like in Greece, where banks can lawfully keep your deposits in an emergency, naming them instead as investments.
Why would the Federal Reserve
And now, once again, the bankers have used the COVID-19 situation as a cover to receive trillions of dollars in bailouts that is then supposed to be paid off by our children and grandchildren instead of going to the small business owners and workers put out of jobs?
the Rockefellers and the Morgans still control it, and they use this scheme to bail themselves out at our expense.
Many of the banks created are still the most powerful lobby on Capitol Hill, and they, frankly, own the place.
I'm convinced that the near collapse of the economy in 2008 resulted from an orchestrated pump and dump scheme designed and executed by the big bankers to consolidate wealth and power. David Icke explains how he sees the Federal Reserve rigging the so-called business cycles.
Stage one, it's like throwing a fishing line out. Stage one, you put lots of money, units of exchange, into circulation. You do this by pushing interest rates down, by making lots of loans. This is the part of the cycle we call a boom. Because there's lots of units of exchange in circulation, there's lots of money changing hands.
Yeah, again, with this whole motif, we were just trying to take this whole boom and bust cycle and break it into something very simple that you can imagine. Here's a boom, you're purchasing something, you know, this is what that looks like in your neighborhood. So the fact that it was cartoonish was just like how to keep this as simple and basic as possible. And I remember my other son was in the process of buying a house at this time, and I remember we set up the house to look like the one that he was buying, with this, you know, couple inside, just trying to make it work, because I could see once you get informed about this, it's so challenging to go through these bank loans and just how hard you have to work to make something happen to support a family. And it's just so rigged and so much more than is necessary. So, yeah, there it is. That was my ode to him and his wife. Fortunately, he's pulled it off, but so many haven't been able to.
Fewer things are being bought.
Just this week, I learned of a current pump and dump that happened where the chief medical officer of Moderna dumped 100% of his shares in the weeks leading up to Moderna's announcement that they had a vaccine ready for trial. So he dumped 10,000 shares a week, made $18 million, and now owns 0 shares of his company's stock. I was listening to Del Bigtree talk about it. He's like, if you watch the captain of your ship jump off, you might wonder what boat you're on.
Now, this economic cycle of fishing line out, fishing line back, lots of units in circulation, pull them in, has been going on for centuries.
The image in the background is actually a picture of a real Rothschild castle.
And accumulated the real wealth of the world in the hands of the few.
At the international level, central bankers use the World Bank and the International Monetary Fund to make
this again where you can hear them say themselves what it is we need to be paying attention to.
them in the process.
Control of the money is just a huge, huge lever.
Rothschild-created Bank for International Settlements. The elite are positioning themselves to control access to virtually everything we need to survive.
No matter where you go in the world, the money is controlled by the banking system. They decide if people eat or if they don't eat.
This was such a complex mix of concepts, of emotions, of visuals, that we finally decided to just bring it all together in a montage so the viewer could experience somehow all of this at once.
At this point, my view of the world had been turned upside down. I was struggling with the realization that the failure and suffering of so many is actually
You can see the backgrounds getting darker. We're sort of at the bottom of the world there, as the stories necessarily having to take us into some of our dark history and reality.
What is their ultimate agenda?
We didn't really know the extent of the whole orchestration of this control system when we started out. And I remember when we were doing the research, and it just kept leading to the same people and the same families. And we live in Santa Cruz, and there's a university, and I remember thinking, we should hire the statistics department to run the numbers and actually see what are the chances that it could just be random that the same people end up benefiting from these horrible things that are happening all over the planet. And I was serious. I like taking advantage of the university, and I really thought running the statistics would be helpful until finally it was just so clear. It didn't matter what sector we were looking at. If you got high enough in it, it was the same people and families. And I actually remember the morning when it finally was just beyond what I could make up excuses for, and I really did feel sick.
First and foremost,
This whole thing with Foster making a checklist and saying he was jumped out of bed one morning, that was actually true. I remember him standing in the doorway when he had just come in with this list.
Now notice we check all the boxes on energy except free energy. This is actually a potential loophole around the centralized domination of energy that we've been working very hard on and will be further explored in Thrive 2.
Yeah, it's also true. Natural alternatives isn't completely shut down. So that's another thing that we'll be checking out quite a bit.
So the internet's one area where we've done pretty well as a species so far, keeping it open. But most of the major social media platforms have been captured by the domination cabal and now blatantly censor truth about vaccines, cancer cures, 5G radiation, and other topics which could expose their deceptions.
Yeah, I think with the RFID chips, it's also happening in relation to COVID-19 because of the tracing and tracking and the notion that there could be some kind of an injectable chip to help you make sure that you don't get exposed or that the exposure can be tracked. So, this has been in the process for a long time, and this provides yet another excuse that would tap into people's concern about their own and each other's well-being. But I think it has huge dangers associated with it, and that I know that these tracking devices, when you look into them, the chipping can both feed signals in as well as pick up signals. And the folks who are talking about this talk about China as being a good example of the control that they've been able to exercise with their social credit score, where you can, disable people from accessing their bank accounts or their ability to travel, all related to how obedient they're being. Again, walking through this whole structure, the idea was if we get the right diagnosis, then we can come up with the right solutions.
Regarding all these secret societies and structures, I personally, throughout my life, have been approached for recruitment by the Masons, by the Templars, by Bohemian Grove, and others. And fortunately, even before I really understood what they were about, I had a repulsion just naturally against the notion of secret societies. Usually, in my experience, when something needs to be kept that secret, it involves perversions of sex, money, and power.
Designed and funded entirely by the Rothschilds.
The all-seeing eye is another one of these symbols that once you understand it, it's remarkable how blatantly consistent their symbol is from one organization to the next. Some say that it's actually part of their code that they need to reveal in some way what they're doing in order to feel free about doing it.
Yeah, and you think about it when you choose a logo, like you think about that. These various sort of logos are identifying the all-seeing eye or whatever it is. They're thinking about it, right? What do you put up there behind you? And when you start to see the consistency, you realize that that was a choice.
Bankers even funded both sides of World War II, as well as some of the corporations associated with Hitler's atrocities against the Jews. Since these people have more money than their families would need for generations, and since they have the power to create money, I don't believe wealth is their end goal.
After you have all the material things that you could possibly want in life, what is left to excite you? And for many people, the answer is power, global power. They became intellectually elite. They began to think that they had a plan that was better than anybody else's plan.
And this is an actual Rothschild castle. This is the one that we saw in the earlier image in the animation.
Freedom. You know what? They're probably not going to use it wisely like we think they should. We are smarter than they are. And for their own good, we should rule them.
As I came to accept the idea of a ruling elite planning for total global domination, I began to hear these same people actually talking more boldly and publicly about it, only they call it the New World Order.
We actually had virtually an endless supply of clips that we could have used to represent these folks talking about very explicitly by the name their New World Order agenda for creating a one world government with, of course, them in charge. And this was a really critical distinction for us to get across to people because, of course, being a global society is real and sounds good, but there's an absolutely critical difference between global totalitarianism and global individual freedom. When I first started hosting this section on the global domination agenda, Kimberly, as my trusted director, was very gentle with me through 19 takes before we finally found a tone that she felt was really working. And she just kept encouraging me to come from my confidence about our way out instead of panic or anger. And it ended up, this not only allowed me to be more centered in my hosting, but it also allowed the viewer the space for their own emotional reaction to the information. And this ended up setting a tone for the whole film of even-temperedness, for which I'm happy to say we've been thanked thousands of times from people all over the world.
The whole notion of conspiracy has been so ridiculed that it's socially challenging just to consider it. The whole conversation about, with David Icke talking about the greatest prison that we live in is, what it is that people think of us. And I have really found that to be true. I mean, first of all, I can remember once getting out of a relationship where I was actually worried about what one of my neighbors would think. Like somebody I hardly had any real relationship with, certainly not someone who would have a significant voice in these major life choices I was making. But that overall concern about how I would be perceived instead of what was my actual truth. And this experience with Thrive, I really got liberated because there were so many uninformed attacks, and I got over it. I got over worrying about people who I don't respect what they think of me, and instead focused on the people who I do respect, which of course that matters, but it's a whole different ballgame to be freed to actually think what I want to think and allow my mind and actions to go where I believe they should go.
Is the fear of what other people think. What happened to me as a result of all the ridicule I went through is that I stepped out of the fear of what other people thought. And it's only when you do it that you realize what a prison you lived in before. And what it gave me was a personal understanding of how easy it is for a few to control the many. All you have to do is dictate the norms in society, what is considered right and wrong.
I remember the day when Kimberly and I were sitting at a restaurant outside of Santa Fe on a tour down there after the movie came out, and there was all sorts of fake debunking stuff coming out about us, and Kimberly just cracked up during the middle of lunch, and I asked her what was going on, and she said, I just got it. I just got liberated about this whole thing, that telling our truth is much more important to me than trying to kowtow to people that we don't really respect.
I remember we actually couldn't order our meal because my laughing got you laughing, and we had this total laugh attack where, and it's lasted. It really did free me and us up.
You say and you think. You're not thinking, if I do, what about the head of the World Bank? What's he going to say if I do this? No. We're saying, what will my mother think? What about the guys down the bar and the people at work? What will they say? And what the Illuminati have done by creating the norms, they have created a
Yeah, I really think, David, I got it just right here in the prison that we keep of each other. I watch how often it is that when our worldview is threatened, that the tendency is to attack the person speaking it rather than consider the new idea. I mean, it's a hard thing to do. Getting worldview shaken is a hard thing to get through, and so worthwhile.
Politicians from the United States, Canada, and Mexico.
And this whole breakdown of the global regional unions for managing the human population, they have continued to try to put these into place, but fortunately it's another area where I think humanity is succeeding in catching on to this, exposing it, and then going the opposite direction from totalitarian consolidation, for instance, with the European Union, with Brexit and now attempts at Grexit, and Germany and Italy are talking about leaving. People are catching on to that national sovereignty and then local sovereignty and ultimately individual sovereignty is the answer, instead of being consolidated under the boot of some global totalitarian state.
In the same fashion. 2009 is also the first year of global governance, with the establishment of the G20 in the middle of the financial crisis.
On the international level, the central banking elite have put huge organizations in place to implement their policies, including the World Trade Organization, the World Health Organization, the World Bank, and the International Monetary Fund. John Perkins is a man who knows from decades of his own experience.
Yeah, John Perkins is an interesting guy. The agenda that he describes, it's been confirmed in Central and South America. It's now pretty much being played out all through the Middle East. And he's a good example of someone who, personally, I am aghast at what he was a part of, that he describes being personally involved in, assassinations and horrific control on the part of the controlling elite. And yet he now has a lot to say about it that is, reflects his own personal process of getting out of that world, and also informs us a lot about what it was all about. So I want to value the part that I can benefit from and learn from, while acknowledging not everything he's ever done or said is something that I agree with or condone. And that's true of everybody in the movie, just about. I'm sure it is. There's nobody on the planet I agree with 100%. And so this notion of being able to benefit from the best of what people have to offer without having to condone or agree with everything that they're doing has been an important part of my learning process.
Mr. President, now that you're president...
And it's a tricky situation because I think it was a very positive move that people in these Central and South American countries got rid of basically foreign corporatism. which was destroying their environment, taking over their economies, and so forth. But at the same time, unfortunately, what they kept getting replaced with was socialist dictatorships. And that doesn't work either, as we can see very clearly in places like Venezuela now. So how to find this sweet spot of not just replacing one corrupt regime with another one, but actually moving toward a free society is the challenge that we're still facing all over the world.
I thought there's no way they could pull off such a scheme at the necessary level of control and secrecy.
One of the false hopes is this is all happening because government is incompetent.
Yeah,
and it's a job.
once again, with Catherine Austin Fitts talking about what looks like a failure is actually a success for a few is an important lens to look through. I know for me, I believe that most people participating in furthering this agenda absolutely don't know what they're a part of. They're doing their part, and that's it. And if they had an alternative, they'd probably do it. And like I said, I don't think that they see their part in the overall big picture of it, because it's just so hard to imagine. People don't just wake up in the morning figuring out how to control the world. It's not a common thought, and so I don't think most people are looking for it or seeing how their actions could contribute to it.
An individual bank, not that there is such a thing. At the bottom, you've got the people you see when you pass your check over the counter in the bank. Now, they don't know what the bank manager behind them knows and is discussing. They only know what they need to know to do their job. The bank manager in the office behind them, he doesn't know or she doesn't know what's happening at the next level, and they don't know what's happening at the next level. And eventually, you've got a tiny few people at the peak of the pyramid of that banking structure. They're the only ones that know what the real agenda of the bank is and what the direction is that they're going and why.
This kind of compartmentalization explains how the Manhattan Project, which developed the atom bomb in World War II, was kept secret despite having 130,000 people working on it.
When I first let in the scale and the intentions of the agenda, I felt like I had the flu for about 2 weeks. But then it dawned on me. Here was this well-planned, well-orchestrated attempt to squelch human potential. Foster and I have had an opportunity in the last several years to be traveling around the world investigating these solutions, and especially those designed to empower the decentralization of people and the sovereignty of individuals with ways to access energy and to stay healthy and prevent illness and cure it if it comes up, and do things in a way that makes it very hard to get them out because they undermine the control matrix. But once out, they empower people to be their glorious, brilliant, innovative selves.
Over everyone, everywhere. In this new world order of theirs, a tiny number of people would exercise total control over the lives of everyone.
One of the things that I've continued to see even more since the movie came out is that people who listen only to right-wing news sources or left-wing news sources, mainstream news sources, have trouble recognizing what's coming. And if you can't recognize what's coming, it's a lot harder to avoid or transcend it. Fortunately, if you know how to search for it, you can actually get the voices of people who are committed to the truth rather than a particular political agenda for control.
I'm now convinced the agenda of the global elite includes destroying the financial strength and sovereignty of the United States. With its history of free speech and armed revolt, America represents the major hurdle to global consolidation of power. If they can succeed in bringing down this country, I believe the international elite intend to transfer the power and productivity of Americans to their one-world dictatorship.
I think that kind of critical thinking also really helps, so that we see that humanity is reliably good and caring for each other in times of disaster. And I think it's important to see the ways that disasters can be used to then kind of trick us into going along with things like a global carbon tax for example, taking our natural concern for the environment and each other and then suggesting that we take that important and natural concern and turn it into something that would actually be completely counterproductive to what we're after. I saw it a lot when I was traveling a lot in the last few years since this came out, as we've been checking out all these solutions all over the world. And every time I would come back into the country, it got absolutely predictable. I could just sort of go, oh, it must be time for a health scare, or maybe it's terrorism this time, but they would just kind of rotate through one thing or another that was supposed to have us suspicious of each other and afraid, and all of that, instead of being united with one another with our attention on what's really in the way and what we can do about it.
You tell the people your version of who did it.
David Icke talks about the problem, reaction, solution dynamic. And finally, a grand jury is actually being assembled in New York to hear the engineers and the architects and other evidence about what really happened in 9/11.
Instead, the mainstream media is a public relations office for the official version of events.
Turns out President George W. Bush was right about Saddam Hussein hiding weapons of mass destruction.
Regarding a cashless society, that has continued and only accelerated. Sweden and other countries have banned almost all cash. You notice you can't use cash on airplanes or purchasing tickets.
Fear, and they want the public to...
Unfortunately, the controllers are now trying to use the pandemic as the new justification to push their agenda for a cashless society with everyone microchipped.
Glean that public reaction with a false story to then openly offer the solutions to the problems they have themselves created.
The idea of using tragedy, manufactured or simply utilized, was deeply significant in my finally understanding how far these people will go to achieve their goals. It's a documented fact.
So one piece of music that was worth it to us to license, even though we're still paying for it now years later, was Richie Haven's Blood on the Wire. So it was just too perfectly aligned with what we were trying to communicate here to miss out on.
I remember this trip to the Vietnamese memorial that had been such an instrumental experience in my life as an activist in Berkeley in the late 60s and early 70s, and the commitment to stop the Vietnam War and my subsequent commitment to that kind of work ever since was really, I think, formed and forged at that time over that war.
And dismantling U.S. constitutional protections.
There are lives in the balance. There are people under fire. There are children at the cannon. There is blood on the wire. There is blood on the wire. There is blood on the wire. There is.
Most of what's needed for a police state is actually already in place. Right now in America, any of us can be imprisoned without warning or due cause, and we can be kidnapped, tortured, and assassinated legally if the government decides what we are doing is a threat to their plan. All they have to do is name us as a suspect in their so-called war on terror. We're being watched more and more. In 2010, there were 30 million surveillance cameras recording us in the U.S. alone.
I remember when we said every phone call, text, and email that you send is being monitored, and that was really controversial at the time. And since then, of course, Snowden's come out and corroborated that from the inside, and now it's just part of the normal conversation and understanding. I think that's happened with a lot of the things that were especially controversial at the time.
Our every move. And now hospital patients are getting these same chips implanted under their skin. In fact, it was Procter & Gamble who developed these chips, initially for tracking their products. It's always offered as a way to help, but even an assistant director of Central Intelligence has admitted it's an entry point to getting all of us chipped for better tracking and control. These would-be controllers, through the U.S. Space Command, have outlined a plan called full spectrum dominance.
These were some of our visual effects that we were most proud of. Our visual effects team actually took a lot of classified information, little bits here and there, and put them together to recreate these technologies, which would be too classified to have actual footage of.
With any resistance. FEMA containment camps and railroad cars with shackles have been recently constructed or refurbished all over the United States for use in what officials call times of pandemic or civil unrest.
Our security team warned us that there are satellites all over the U.S. that could read our lips if we were sitting out on our deck, or even just in through the windows. We were supposed to close our curtains. So there were times when we were planning some of the things, especially around the new energy inventions. That's where it was really the riskiest, that we would have to make our plans with our hands covering our mouths. It was so weird. We like have these Thrive team meetings covering our mouths.
Or we'd have a meeting about the new energy or health technologies, and we'd have to ask everybody to keep their mobile phones in the cars, or we'd put them all in a copper soup pot that we used as a Faraday cage to interrupt the signals of any of the phones listening to the conversation.
For absolute control, if there are fewer of us to
I always found it weird that that's been so normalized for us, this notion of surveillance. I remember reading Lillian Hellman and the whole situation during World War II of some of the resistance and how these undercover things would be going down. And now I see it where the notion of Faraday cages to be testing for new energy technologies that can't be picked up then, or locking up our phones, just all the ways that we've normalized it into our lives. Not a good sign.
And currently with the corona situation, there's a whole new excuse for the deep state to grasp for draconian levels of surveillance, tracing, and tracking. So Kimberly and I had the opportunity in this incident to bring our sector solutions model to our communities in Northern California to try to stop this toxic aerial spraying. And people were able to coordinate by sectors like media and science and health and relationships and so forth. And the bottom line was 7 counties collaborated in a well-organized effort that ended up in discovering the truth behind this toxic spray and then stopping a presidential decree program that had appropriated $1 billion out of Homeland Security to spray Northern California for up to 10 years. And together we were able to stop it in about 6 months.
Mass covert sterilization of women and girls, usually using secret additives to vaccines, has been exposed in Brazil, Puerto Rico, Nicaragua, Mexico, and the Philippines. These have been under the auspices of such programs as John D. Rockefeller's Population Council, the U.S. Department of Health, Education, and Welfare, where Nelson Rockefeller was undersecretary, and the Rockefeller-founded World Health Organization. Novartis and Syngenta, in cooperation with the U.S. Department of Agriculture and the Department of Defense, have field-tested a spermicidal strain of GMO corn that would render male consumers infertile. This was quietly announced as a contribution to the world overpopulation problem.
So this whole conversation about what to include, how much of our research actually would make it into the film, was a big one, and especially how gruesome to get with the dangerous and heartbreaking information, I guess, that we came across. And we decided that we did need to get into depopulation, because if people weren't aware of that possibility, then they wouldn't be looking to the appropriate level of solutions, because they wouldn't have sufficiently identified the problem. So we put on the screen what we believe that looked like and the form that it would be taking if we didn't avert the direction that we were going. And you can see that we had toxic vaccines and irradiation, which we now see in the form of 5G and the man-made pandemic. So it's, it's sort of like you know, if you're obese and you're eating hamburgers, you can count on having a heart problem. And if there's a global corporate takeover going on that weakens countries and centralizes everything so that people are not empowered in their own sovereignty or in their decentralized communities, this is what can be expected. So here we are, and so we're dealing with it at a later stage, which is harder, but nonetheless, we're dealing with it.
The time has come to say, enough. There is another way. I believe that together we have the knowledge, the resources, and the solutions to meet that challenge. I see this process as nothing less than a struggle for the soul of humanity.
So in relation to David Rockefeller, I actually went to a boarding school back east for high school where David Rockefeller's son was in the class behind me. So I can look back on having actually met him several times, and he just seemed like a sweet little old guy. Little did I know. But after the film came out, we were actually approached by several different members of the Rockefeller family who have verified what we represented in this film. And we were delighted to see that in some cases, particularly in the youngest generation, they're committed to changing the course of that particular legacy that we called out in Thrive.
And compassion. A world where every...
So I'd been researching the global domination agenda for decades, but it wasn't until we finally saw solutions that were really commensurate to the problem that we decided, okay, now it's time to go ahead and make Thrive.
The agenda of the ruling elite is the product of a destructive worldview, based on their beliefs that there's not enough to go around, that some people are more deserving than others, and that their own safety depends on maintaining absolute control over the rest of us.
Notice how the background is now the bright sunny days as we get into solutions.
The architects of the New World Order cannot create their dreadful vision without our collusion. To stop them, to render their agenda obsolete, we have to wake up. We have to take action.
This is like the last effort.
In the years since Thrive came out, I've thought a lot about Elizabeth Torus and the imaginal cells. We've been contacted by close to 1,000 different innovators and solutions from all over the world, and I just think these are the imaginal cells that Elizabeth was talking about.
And its skin turns into a hardened chrysalis. And then in its body, you get these imaginal cells. Biologists actually call them that, forming within the caterpillar's body. The caterpillar's body then actually becomes a nutritive soup.
This notion of coexisting with the elite controllers and those who want to replace that way with the thriving world, I think it's really an important thing that I've noticed is like this whole interface of new technologies with the existing grid, for example. There is just a certain amount of coexistence that's happening, and the more we can make it cooperative, the better we can get there, because if so few people really are knowing what it is they're participating in, then if you can have them keep their jobs, it's a good idea, or at least turn their jobs into something that is more helpful for them to be doing.
Administration to produce it for you. We have to produce it. We imaginal cells have to show that it's cheaper, more efficient, and more effective. Our job is to build a new world.
If we had the vision and a worldview...
It's poignant to see our dear Barbara Marx Hubbard here. She passed on in 2019, and she was a beloved ally for 20 years. And we are so grateful and honored to have her vision and her bright eyes in the film.
It may seem that the controlling elite has all the cards, but we have many advantages of our own. First, let's talk numbers. Very few people are consciously perpetrating the domination agenda. Most of those helping to implement the plan don't understand the full picture of what they're a part of. By my calculations, we outnumber the actual architects of the plan by more than 1,000,000 to 1 in the US alone. Entrepreneur and environmentalist Paul Hawken.
So Paul Hawken talks about the social and environmental groups connecting all around the world. And since Thrive came out, there are now over 1,000 self-created, Thrive-inspired solutions groups in close to 100 countries around the world.
Could become a network of networks that will be the most powerful activist force for change ever.
If you look at the people who are involved with restoring this earth and stopping the damage and resisting the depredation and nurturing change and reimagining what it means to be a human being, and you're not optimistic, then you might want to get your heart checked, because there is an extraordinary, beautiful, gorgeous, fierce group of people in this world who are taking this on.
The second important advantage for us is that all the power centers that the elite control require our participation.
This turned out to be really valuable for a lot of viewers in the feedback that we got, for them to understand that there's actually a few people perpetrating this and that we outnumber them. And it's really a house of cards of getting us to believe that they should rule us. As that collapses, then people and freedom can actually rise.
It takes tremendous energy, resources, and deception to try to dominate the lives of others. In moving toward freedom, on the other hand, we have on our side the evolutionary life force and what Gandhi called satyagraha, the simple power of truth.
In India, we have thousands of villages which are now freedom zones. So we will not accept patenting. We will not cooperate with it, just like Gandhi did not cooperate with salt laws. We will not allow chemicals and genetically engineered crops.
You don't hear about it a lot in the mainstream media, but there are countless wonderful stories arising. There's good news headlines that we should be seeing in every sector and all over the world, and we'll be updating that a lot in the upcoming Thrive 2.
In the movement for GMO-free zones in Europe. I turn my back, and there's another 1,000 GMO-free zones. 90% of Italy, 90% of Austria. The freedom zones around the seed, around food, are creating massive shifts.
In Bolivia, a grassroots movement took to the streets.
I love this grassroots activism, and in Bolivia, the people banging pots and pans until they could get the necessary attention for the water-destroying corporation to leave. It's just fabulous, the power that we actually have.
Imagine if these were the kinds of headlines that we actually woke up to every day.
I wasn't willing to make this film until I knew there were responses that are a match for the crisis. And now the power of the internet enables us to share the breadth and the depth of this research.
We've spent years creating a vast website, thrivemovement.com.
So we put a lot of time and effort into our website, and the point was to give every visitor their own Navigator module by which they could travel around the world, by which they could explore any sector and find out the problems, the solutions, and ultimately to connect with other solutions groups. We designed this Navigator tool to be at the bottom of every page, and it was very important to me, especially because it allowed people to see all of the world's activities at a glance. And we animated this so that people would learn how to use it, and it was the bottom of every page. And the simple fact of the matter was, people aren't used to navigating the internet that way. They didn't use it. It took up a lot of extra memory, and so I had to let go of one of my little darlings.
In every sector, you'll find...
That's what we used to call it. Anytime we had to get rid of something, in honor, Stephen King called those our little darlings. We actually had it around here. If you could get a word out of the script, you could win a pop chip. These kind of chips that Foster's favorite in particular, and it was a way to get reward for somehow getting rid of something so that we make this as concise as possible. So believe it or not, it is. With the 12 around 1 model, we actually consulted with about a dozen other organizations to make sure that we were using the same terms. So new energy technology would fit under infrastructure, for example, for all of us. And it's really what makes, certainly global, but even community organizing way more effective if you know that everybody working on that issue is calling it the same thing. You can share resources a lot better and make communication happen a lot faster and more efficiently.
Currencies and independent banks, and refuse international taxes. My main emphasis is on solutions in the U.S., because that's what I know best. But just as the predicament is global.
And exploring the sectors on the website allows people to discover that if you get to the principles underlying the destruction of wholeness of any natural system, and you learn how to restore that wholeness, you can actually base your solutions on real principles that are eternal and universal rather than on temporary power politics, which is what's got the whole world on the verge of global civil war right now.
And into locally owned banks and credit unions, we defund the problem and fund the solution all in one move. Buy and invest responsibly. Every dollar you spend sends a message. Join the movement.
When we talked about allowing alternative currencies, there was no Bitcoin yet at that time. We were advocating for a true free market in currencies and banking in our public events and so forth, and we were pleasantly surprised at how fast now this is all happening.
Independent media. It's funny in looking at this now, seeing how much we put free speech TV as our icon of good media, and then when Thrive came out, they actually refused to broadcast it. It was one of these things where as a leftist network, or it didn't matter, left, right, people were expecting us to be somehow on their team, and the notion that we were transpolitical and we included people with all kinds of beliefs ended up really showing everybody's true colors. It will transform the power dynamic on this planet faster than any.
And we push here again for the new energy technologies. And I've been fortunate to spend most of the last 5 years vetting technologies all over the world. And we'll be giving an exciting update on that in the upcoming Thrive 2 as well.
Imagine 1 million of us acting in unison. Then again, imagine even more.
I've been inspired by how many grounded solutions and real-life problem solvers there actually are. Aquila Sherrills is one person whose work especially touched me. He helped broker a gang truce between the Crips and Bloods.
One of the things that we discovered in the process of waging peace in the neighborhood was that conflict is healthy. It's unresolved conflict that actually leads to violence. When we first launched the peace treaty, we had a lot of success in our first year. Gang homicides dropped 44% in the neighborhood based upon our actions.
Aquila describes what happened when two rival gang leaders finally met after the truce.
The brother came up to him and told him, man, look, I know you got some hard feelings for me. Maybe I got some hard feelings for you.
This is one of the scenes that still moves me to tears after seeing this film hundreds of times. And Aquila is one of our dear friends and someone who actually lost his child to a gang shooting, an inadvertent drive-by mistake, and members of a gang came to him and said, okay, we'll go and avenge this. And he stood up to them and said, no, this is where it stops.
That embrace, he realized that, that it was genuine.
So notice that the backgrounds now have gone from underneath a dark earth to a really radiant scene with a view of the whole earth. And this is a part of our effort to convey the hope that comes with true principles and with real solutions. And here we're literally looking through the lens of the Torus, which is what we're encouraging people to do metaphorically as seeing the restoration of the wholeness of natural systems in terms of understanding the blueprint of this toroidal dynamic by which nature sustains healthy systems at every scale throughout the universe.
Rather than focusing on punishment, Instead, justice restores lives and losses. Insurance pays doctors to keep people healthy.
Another thing I wanted to do after we did Thrive was I gathered 3 of the economists that we had interviewed for the film, and I asked them to do some calculations as to how it would affect the lives of normal people if we had an honest banking system, if we had free energy, got rid of the Federal Reserve. And their conclusion was that the average adult and family would have 6 to 10 times the amount of both income and assets. So just take a moment and picture your life where you open up your bank account and you've got 8 times as much, not only in your income, but also of your assets. And see then, what would you feel like? How could you help people who are still in need? What would the world look like in a truly prosperous financial system?
Money from things that make their kids safer and prevent the planet from dying.
Again, Catherine's just got such a natural way with her metaphor. She talks about the popsicle index as a way to determine how safe is your community. Can your kid ride their bike down to the local store and get a popsicle and come home without you worrying about it? And then, when we're all freed up because we can do meaningful work for our income and then have our weekends to go to the beach. She just really has a way of bringing it home.
And you don't get to violate anyone else.
So this non-aggression principle is really at the core of the whole movement toward a free society from our perspective. And that's why we call it the true north of the moral compass that we represent in the center of the Navigator module. And we'll go much deeper into that in the upcoming Thrive 2.
This insight can guide us and protect each and every individual as we set up voluntary, self-sustaining systems. It is a way of living that I can stand for wholeheartedly and without reservation. I've been profoundly influenced by the work of Austrian economist Ludwig von Mises, who developed a whole philosophy and economic system based on the core ethic of non-aggression. Motivated by having witnessed the ravages of communism and fascism in Europe, he committed his life to finding a just way. He recognized that those systems, as well as socialism and even democracy, wrongly assume the rights of the collective, or the group, to be more important than those of the individual. I had always gone along with the view that more people will thrive if we consider the group's needs above the individual's. But when I took a closer look, I found it doesn't really work that way. In the name of what's best for the group, governments have been responsible for most of the war, death, and destruction on the planet. More than 200 million individuals were killed in the 20th century alone. So how would applying the principle of non-violation change this dynamic? It would take us from incremental change of a fundamentally flawed system to a complete transformation where not just some, or even the majority, but everyone could truly have the opportunity to thrive. In order to implement the principle of non-violation, it makes sense to me to honestly re-examine our past because it doesn't work to try to build a healthy living system on top of an unhealthy one.
This was really important to me to include our history with the Native Americans because I just felt like if I didn't know we were going to make Thrive 2, I thought if this is my one shot at saying what I think is most important, I said, fitting bees in there and the things that I care about. Another thing that I really cared about was making sure that we address this issue because I don't know how to solve it, but I know whatever we come up with in the future needs to include a reconciliation with our past.
Completed 150 years ago. There are wrongs that are continued every single day.
So you have, through the history of North America and the United States.
And Yvonne Peters, the youngest ever chief of the Mi'tsai-Gwich'in, a tribe up in Alaska. And he's just a wonderful person, continuing to work with his wife, Ine, with the Native movement up there. He's actually working in education now and really expanding the inclusion of a lot of other natives in education and in the understanding that he has. I benefited hugely. He and I were on a board together, and his friendship and insights have been valuable to me from the day I met him.
It's going to take time, and courageous effort to shift the consciousness and accomplish the tasks that will move us toward the world I'm talking about. And yet I know of no greater gift that we could give to future generations. We can't do everything at once.
This was a really fun animation for us because we just got to spend our time envisioning the world that we know is possible and what would it look like? What would this transition actually look like?
If we cut the US military budget in half, it would still roughly equal the defense spending of the entire rest of the world. Between that and getting rid of the Federal Reserve, over $1 trillion a year would be freed. Enough to feed everyone on our planet, deal with social issues, and heal our environment.
So we get organic foods and the community center, and where there's some despondent person in front of a bar, it can, turn into some great place for people to be gathering in community. And we get rid of the unemployment lines. And I know somewhere in here we had a skate park that we did in honor. I have a skater kid, so we wanted to make sure to have that and really move through the best of the left, the best of the right into this whole trans-political solution that is so key to our idea of what's possible.
Conservative worldview.
So this was our best shot at, in a short amount of time, trying to represent a simple and non-coercive business plan for transforming into a thriving world. How do you take the best of the left and the best of the right and actually move into a free world?
Yeah, that clock on the wall there had 11:11. We knew that we were going to be coming out on 11:11, and so we put it on the clock. There were so many little touches like that all through here. Here we have every, imaginable size, shape, gender, color, whatever it is, of people in our new free world. Oh, there's a free energy station. We had an invention center, a new ideas center.
Individual rights turns out to be key for honoring our interdependence.
Think tanks for unsolved problems.
And unified at the same time.
Yeah, there's the Inventor Center and the skate park.
First, I've been thrilled to see how much practical thinking has been done to...
Our whole team got to envision what they most wanted in interplanetary exploration, all of the things that would make sense that people would be developing.
Both the liberal and conservative perspectives that have divided us for...
And this was another opportunity to try to use cinema to solve the problem of gathering so much information, so many different concepts in a very short and kind of impressionistic amount of time, to show a pattern for transition rather than having to break down all the details of how exactly it would happen.
The Torus provides a...
This is an innovative city with a radial design, a whole new form of sort of land use that we're just getting in the world of creativity, how we could design cities and do all kinds of things differently.
We can apply these and other features of the Torus dynamic to our human social systems. I truly believe that aligning consciously with the fundamental life energy pattern at every level, physical, emotional, mental, interpersonal, and environmental, is ultimately the art, the science, and the celebration of love. And that's what we're here to learn. The fundamental insight of our interconnectedness changed the way I approach everything. In my own life, I found a practice...
So Aikido was the first of the three, I would say, major revelations that I've had in my life. Because with Aikido, I learned how you could be strong and gentle at the same time. And then these same principles I discovered were behind the success of free energy devices. And then finally coming to the liberty perspective, I realized they're all the same thing. They're all just different ways that human beings can align with the patterns of nature harmoniously. And that's what it's going to take in every sector to actually have a thriving, secure, and prosperous civilization.
Redirecting it to peaceful resolution.
That's my longtime Aikido teacher, so I was glad to get a chance to acknowledge him in the film.
Gandhi and King applied these principles of non-aggressive power at the economic and social levels. If we respond with violence to the domination agenda, other than in self-defense, it would only continue the old us versus them paradigm and provide an excuse for even more police state measures. I believe that it's essential, both morally and strategically, that we take the path of non-aggression. There is another aspect of the Torus that has profound implications for how we can respond to the challenges before us. It is the absolute stillness, the 0 point, that lies at the center of each toroidal system. I believe that you and I, as well as every other being, are Torus energy fields, centered by stillness.
This notion of a still point and this image of our connection and then of the Torus around the woman is something that I actually picture quite a bit in my morning meditations. It's just been an image that's been able to stay with and inform me and remind me when it's time to come back to center, which is always. So this image is one that reminds me, it reminds me of my process and is ongoing. And this exploration of consciousness is something that's been a primary passion of mine, and especially since Thrive One came out, I've spent a lot of time. I traveled quite a bit in Costa Rica, where I actually was introduced to some fabulous shaman from Colombia and explored plant medicine and breath work and other various forms of consciousness exploration, I guess, is the best way to describe it. And it's something that we're going to also be talking a lot more about in Thrive 2.
As we develop increased relationship to who's in the driver's seat, what happens is there is a synergy. It's a symbiotic relationship that our inner lives are actually able to be more in tandem with where we're choosing to go, and we're able to get there. We're not nearly as insignificant in our impact as we think we are.
In order to heal the world, we have to start telling a different story to ourselves. We have to start engaging in a different story with others. It's our collective story that manifests as the world.
Humanity is now in a very interesting evolutionary phase in which we move from hostile, aggressive competition, which is the nature of young species, into a more mature mode of cooperation, collaboration.
There's no question in this country that money, that capital is being increasingly concentrated in the hands of a few. And those who are so powerful are concentrating it further. But there is a force that's more powerful, and that's the power of the people.
When we look at the crises now, it is so easy to fall out of love with life. It is so easy to get pessimistic and desperate. But from my perspective, the crisis has matured to the point of being on the threshold of mass awakening, and that feeling inside me gives me the vitality to know that no matter how small what I'm doing looks to me in the face of these huge problems, that the impulse of evolution is not small. And when it's in everybody who's waking up, it's huge.
So we chose to come home for the final scene to where Kimberly and I live, in the San Francisco Bay Area. And as well, it's what Bucky Fuller called the navigating cockpit of spaceship Earth. It's just been a place for freedom of thought at an unusual level in the world, where conflicting ideas can usually be heard and explored.
Stood up for liberty. I am confident humankind will look back on this period and be proud that when we saw, we acted. Thank you for coming on this journey with us. I'm convinced we have what it takes to thrive. Let's make it happen.
And for me, it just felt so great, finally, after laying a very comprehensive foundation for what we were seeing, to be able to make this final statement and really invite the world to participate in transforming our situation into a thriving one.
We had absolutely no idea in the making of Thrive whether or not people would respond to it. We frequently would say, well, maybe it'll end up as some kind of a time capsule on another planet, or we'll be here at another time when people are ready for it. We truly had no idea. Even though networks, free speech TV and such didn't want to play Thrive, fortunately it spread like crazy with just word of mouth. And now, as we're recording this, there are over 90 million documented views, and very grateful because that's the way we have to rely on each other to get our messages out.
This is probably my favorite image of the whole movie, where these organic bamboo shoots are actually breaking through the concrete and going to the light. Because for me, that symbolizes what's possible for humanity right now, and it can seem so impossible to just even survive, much less to thrive. But the irrepressible courage of humanity is what gives me confidence that this image is exactly what can happen in our society right now.
Gratefully, it was the right time and the right place, and we're also having a wonderful time now tracking the solutions that have come our way as a result of doing this.
So one of the things we learned from experience with Thrive 1 is that hardly anyone wants to sit through credits, no matter how beautiful or entertaining you try to make them. So it's not a great place to park your award-winning original theme song.
We dedicated this to people who had gone before and who inspired us to do this project, and it was also to the life force that was ignited in us and that everyone has responded to. It was very touching to work this hard and then see, what do we dedicate this to? And it was to that urge that the life force has itself to live and to evolve, and to the fabulous people who've come before us and their courage to really invoke that. And we had the honor of working with fantastic people. Ariel and Austin. Ariel is my stepdaughter, and Austin Willisey, Ariel Tierman and Austin Willisey, who co-wrote, and then Gary Malkin produced the theme song, which went on to win the Posy Music Award for Most Inspiring Song in 2018, I think it was. Anyway, it was really fun working with the crew and the musicians, and many have come back on board for Thrive 2.
We all have what it takes to thrive. They come together when the water's right. There's a stirring deep inside. Deep inside. They come together to stand up for our life. We all have what it takes to thrive. Come together while the water's right.
So you'll notice that we spend a lot of time in star fields, and this is where we end. And that's because of the expansive nature of getting a reminder of where we are. And I saw a headline that helps kind of put this in perspective. It said, scientists from 85 countries working together just found 300,000 new galaxies.
So that does it for our commentary on Thrive. What on earth will it take? Stay tuned for our sequel, which is Thrive 2, This is What It Takes.